Sign it, Dad, or I'll stand in a courtroom and prove you're too far gone to raise anyone, senile, broke, and dangerous. Julianne's voice hit the kitchen like a wrench dropped on concrete, and before Elias answered, his hand was already moving to the ticking weight pressed flat against his heart, the only truth in the room he wasn't ready to hand over. The guardianship petition lay between them on the scarred pine table. The overhead bulb flickered once, buzzing against the silence that followed. Elias didn't move. He sat with his spine straight against the ladder-back chair his own father had built 40 years ago, his weathered hands resting flat on his knees. Outside, the wind off the Banff peaks rattled the window frame, carrying with it the mineral bite of fresh snow and pine resin. Inside, the wood stove ticked and popped, throwing amber light across a kitchen that smelled of stewed venison, machine oil, and the faint metallic tang of a man who had spent 5 decades with his hands inside engines. He said nothing. His hand stayed where it had gone, flat against the flannel shirt worn soft as cloth can get, and beneath it, the outline of a small, hard shape in his breast pocket. Tick. 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 The sound was so faint that Julianne, seated across from him in her charcoal wool coat that had never once touched Alberta snow honestly, didn't register it. But Elias heard it the way a man hears his own pulse. The silver pocket watch, his retirement gift from Canadian Pacific Railway after 31 years of laying and inspecting track through the Rockies, kept its rhythm against his ribs. Patience. That was what the watch had always meant to him. Tonight it meant something closer to restraint. A discipline holding back a secret so heavy it could crack the floorboards. You haven't even looked at him, Elias said finally, his voice low and rough as gravel under a boot. Julianne blinked, as if the sentence had arrived in a language she'd half forgotten. Beside her, in a chair too polished for this kitchen, sat Grant, a junior partner at one of Calgary's downtown firms, his charcoal suit immaculate, his cologne cutting sharp through the smell of wood smoke. He hadn't taken off his gloves. He glanced toward the corner of the room where a boy of 15 stood half in shadow, arms crossed, jaw tight. Toby. He had his father's eyes, a fact that no one in that kitchen but Elias seemed to remember, or wanted to. Julianne's gaze flicked toward her nephew for perhaps half a second, the way a person glances at a piece of furniture they're deciding whether to keep. Then it slid away, back to the petition on the table, back to the leverage she'd built her whole visit around. I'm looking at the boy's future, she said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. A boarding school in Toronto. Tutors. A future that doesn't smell like a mechanic's bay. You call that neglect, Dad? I call it rescue. Elias's jaw tightened. He knew what this was. He'd known since the moment her car, a rental, black, absurdly clean against the slush of the driveway, had pulled up outside the cabin 3 days ago. Julianne hadn't come out of love. She'd come because the Thorne family portrait she was building for her new in-laws had a hole in it shaped exactly like a photogenic, well-mannered 15-year-old with the family name. A woman who could not have children of her own needed one to display, and the display needed to be flawless, freshly scrubbed of anything that looked like the working-class grandfather who'd raised him. She had buried where she came from as surely as the snow buried the tracks behind the cabin every winter. He has a home, Elias said. Right here. A shack with a wood stove and a leaking roof is not a home, it's a liability, Grant cut in smoothly, uncapping a pen that looked worth more than Elias's truck. Mr. Thorne, if you'd simply, nobody asked the lawyer to speak in my kitchen, Elias said, and something in his tone made even Grant pause. Julianne leaned forward, and here her voice dropped, sharpened, found the exact place she knew would hurt. You want to talk about homes, Dad? Let's talk about the home you gave my brother. Let's bring up in front of a judge exactly how your parenting record turned out the first time. Failed once already, didn't you? Or should I remind you what they found him doing before he ended up dead in a ditch outside Canmore? The kitchen went silent except for the stove's low crackle. Elias's hand closed, not on the petition, not on Julianne's wrist, but on the old leather-bound notebook tucked behind the flannel, hidden beneath his jacket where no one could see it. A truck inspector's logbook, decades out of use for its original purpose. His fingers pressed into the cover as if he could keep whatever was inside from spilling out through sheer force of will. He would rather be called senile. He would rather be called broke, unfit, dangerous, every ugly word Julianne's lawyer could invent, before he let a single page of that notebook see daylight in this kitchen. Toby, in the corner, had gone very still. "Grandpa," he said quietly. "What is she talking about? About Dad?" Elias didn't answer. His silence, in that moment, felt like its own kind of confession, and he watched something flicker across Toby's face, confusion first, then something colder, more wounded, as though the boy suspected his grandfather was hiding something and had decided, right there, that the hiding itself was a kind of betrayal. Julianne saw it too. She smiled, thin and satisfied, the same tight curl at the corner of her mouth she'd worn every time she'd out-argued him since she was 9 years old. "There it is," she murmured. "Even you can't defend it, can you?" "Get out of my house," Elias said. "It's not your house that's in question, Dad. It's your fitness." She rose, buttoning her coat with unhurried precision, savoring the moment the way she'd savored little else in that kitchen. She turned to Grant. "Call Children's Services. Alberta CFS. Now. Right here, in front of him, so there's no confusion later about who tried to do this the civil way." Grant already had the phone to his ear before Elias could speak, his voice smooth and rehearsed as he recited an address on a rural route outside Banff, his eyes flicking with distaste toward the wood stove, the row of greasy tools hung along the wall, the pot of stew simmering with nothing green in it, nothing that looked, to him, like proper nutrition for a child of good breeding. Elias stood. Slowly. His knees ached in the cold the way they always did in November, but he didn't let it show on his face. He looked at Toby instead, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself in front of Julianne, because looking meant the boy might see the fear underneath. "Toby," he said, and his voice, for the first time all evening, was almost gentle. "Go on and get some sleep. This is grown folks' business." But Toby didn't move. He stood there with his arms crossed, jaw set exactly like his father's used to set, staring at the notebook-shaped bulge under his grandfather's shirt as if some part of him, some instinct he didn't yet have words for, understood that whatever was pressed against the old man's heart mattered more than anything being shouted across that table. Behind Elias's ribs, steady as ever, the watch kept its rhythm. Tick. 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 The caseworker arrived at 8 the next morning, before the frost had even burned off the truck windshield. She introduced herself as Ms. Whitfield, clipboard in hand, a government parka zipped to her chin, and she walked through the cabin the way a person walks through a crime scene, pausing at the wood stove, crouching to examine the ash pan. "Is this your only heat source?" she asked, pen already moving. "Works fine," Elias said. "Kept this family warm for 40 years. "And the boys' meals?" She glanced at the pot still on the stove from the night before, congealed now, a film of fat gone pale across the surface. "Meat and potatoes. Is there a vegetable component to his diet?" "There's a garden come spring." "It's November, Mr. Thorne." Toby stood in the doorway of his room, arms crossed, watching the woman note something on her clipboard with a small, tight frown. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Elias could see the boy cataloging every question, every note, the way each one landed like a small stone dropped into a still pond, rings spreading outward. "Only to see where he sleeps," Miss Whitfield said. "Second door on the left," Elias answered, and stood aside, jaw tight, watching a stranger walk into his grandson's room and open the closet like she had a right to. By that afternoon, the letters had started. 3 of them, hand-delivered by a courier who didn't bother to knock twice, all bearing the letterhead of Ashworth, Kellerman and Doyle, LLP, Calgary. Elias sat at the kitchen table and read them slowly, his lips moving faintly over the legal language, one thick finger tracing under each line like he still expected the words to rearrange themselves into something less cruel. Pattern of neglect, unsanitary conditions, psychological harm consistent with isolation and emotional abuse. Our client requests immediate. "They're calling me a drug," Elias said out loud, to no one, because Toby had gone to do homework at the far end of the table and hadn't looked up in an hour. I haven't had a drink in 22 years. Doesn't matter what's true, Toby muttered, not looking up from his textbook. It matters what they can write down. Elias looked at his grandson for a long moment. There was something in the boy's voice, flat, resigned, older than 15, that scared him more than any letter from Calgary. That night, and every night after, Elias sat in the chair beside Toby's bed long after the boy had fallen asleep, listening to the wind claw at the eaves, listening to the watch tick against his ribs. He didn't reach for the notebook. Not yet. He told himself the letter inside it, the folded ache he'd carried for 15 years, could stay buried a little longer. That the truth, once loosed, could never be called back, and once Julianne knew he had it, there would be no more Christmases, no more chance, however small, that she might one day look her nephew in the eye and mean it. But some nights, his hand found the notebook anyway, resting flat against it through the flannel, as if he could keep the whole terrible weight of it contained just by pressing hard enough. The boxes started arriving on a Thursday. The first was a Burton snowboard, top of the line, still smelling of factory plastic, propped against the porch rail with a card that read, "Can't wait for Whistler with you, sweetheart. Aunt J." The second, 2 days later, was a laptop, sleek and silver, worth more than Elias made in 3 months of part-time work at the rail yard. Toby carried it to his room without a word, but Elias saw the way his grandson's hands moved over the box, careful, almost reverent, the way a boy touches something he's been told he can't have. "You don't need to open it," Elias said from the doorway. "I'm just looking." "Toby." "I said I'm just looking, Grandpa." The boy's voice cracked upward, sharp. "God. Can I look at a laptop without you standing there like I'm about to rob a bank?" Elias let it go. He told himself it was just a laptop. But 3 nights later, over a dinner of stew that had, this time, actual carrots in it, a small, silent concession to Ms. Whitfield's clipboard, Toby set down his fork with a clatter. "Aunt Julianne says there's a private school outside Toronto. Says I could do robotics club there. Says they have an actual engineering lab, not just," he gestured at the garage door beyond the kitchen window, at the shapes of tools hanging in the dark, not just a bunch of old snowmobile parts. "Those old snowmobile parts put a roof over your head. A roof that's about to get me taken away." Toby's voice rose, cracking with something between anger and fear. "Do you get that? Do you understand what's happening? They're going to take me to a courtroom, Grandpa, and you're going to sit there and lose, because you won't even tell them anything, you won't even defend yourself properly, you just sit there with your jaw shut like some kind of... Watch your mouth. Why won't you fight?" Toby's chair scraped back hard against the floor as he stood. "You have something. I've seen you. Every night, sitting there with your hand on your chest like you're guarding the crown jewels. What is it? What are you not telling me?" Elias's throat worked once, twice, before any sound came out. "It's not something for you to carry. Maybe I want to carry it. Maybe I'm sick of being the only person in this whole mess who doesn't know anything." Toby's eyes were bright, furious, wet. "Maybe Aunt Julianne's right. Maybe you really do just want to keep me stuck out here in this dump forever, fixing carburetors, instead of letting me have an actual future." The words landed like a slap. Elias didn't flinch outwardly. Decades of gripping wrenches and sub-zero cold had taught him how to keep his hands steady no matter what shook inside him, but something in his chest folded inward, quietly, the way old wood gives before it finally splits. "Is that what you think?" he said. Not a question. Barely even a sentence. Toby didn't answer. He grabbed his jacket off the hook and slammed out into the snow, and Elias sat alone at the table with 2 half-finished bowls of stew going cold, and the watch in his pocket ticking on, indifferent, relentless, counting seconds he didn't know how many of he had left with the boy. The workshop confrontation happened 4 days later, on a Saturday, with frost thick on the single window and the smell of engine grease hanging in the cold air. Elias was elbow-deep in the guts of an old skidoo when the door banged open and Julianne stepped through in boots clearly never meant for snow, her breath fogging, her face set in an expression Elias had learned, over the last 2 weeks, to dread. I want a word, she said. Alone. Toby, wiping his hands on a rag beside his grandfather, straightened. I'm not leaving. Fine, Julianne said, and rounded on Elias without missing a beat. You had the nerve, the absolute nerve, to tell Miss Whitfield that my fiancé and I are, quote, buying the boy's affection with junk he doesn't need. Do you have any idea what that kind of statement does to a custody file? I told her the truth. You told her a version that makes me look like a villain in front of a government agent who now has to write a report about it. Julianne's voice climbed, sharp enough to bounce off the tin roof. Do you know what I gave up to build a life that could give this boy something better than, she gestured at the workshop, the grease-stained bench, the half-dismantled snowmobile, than this? Do you have any idea? I know exactly what you gave up, Elias said quietly, and something in his tone made even Julianne pause. I know better than you think. She stared at him a moment, some old, unreadable calculation moving behind her eyes, and then she turned it on Toby instead, the way she always did when she couldn't win against the father. You want to know why your father ended up dead in a ditch outside Canmore, she said, voice suddenly ugly, brittle. Because he was a washed-up mess with a record longer than my arm. A drunk who couldn't hold a job, couldn't hold a marriage, couldn't hold anything, and froze to death because he was too far gone to find his way home from a bar. That's the man you're so desperate to know more about. That's the legacy your grandfather's been protecting you from. Julianne. Elias's voice came out low, dangerous, a sound Toby had never heard from him before. Stop. Why? Because it's true? That's enough. But it was too late. Toby had gone white, then red, his jaw working, his eyes filling despite every effort to stop it. Shut up, he said, barely above a whisper, then louder, shut up. And he threw the rag down on the workbench and shoved past both of them, out through the workshop door into the biting wind, boots crunching hard and fast through the snow toward the tree line, not looking back. Elias made to follow. Julianne caught his sleeve. Let him go, she said. Let him cool off. Then let him come to me. Elias yanked his arm free, hard enough that she stumbled back a step against the workbench, and for one terrible second neither of them said anything, the wind screaming past the open door, the cold pouring in around them both. Get off my property, he said. She left without another word, boots skidding on the ice by the truck, engine roaring to life, gravel spitting under the tires as she pulled away down the frozen drive. Elias found Toby an hour later, sitting on an overturned bucket behind the equipment shed, knees drawn to his chest, face raw from crying and cold. He didn't say anything. He just sat down on the frozen ground beside him, joints protesting, and waited. Was he really like that? Toby asked finally, voice small. My dad? Elias closed his eyes. Somewhere behind his ribs, the watch kept ticking, steady, relentless, as though counting down toward something Elias could feel coming but could not yet name. No, he said. He wasn't. Then why won't you tell me what really happened? Elias had no answer that night. He walked Toby back inside in silence, tucked a blanket over the boy's shoulders on the couch by the stove, and once the house had gone quiet, once the only sound left in the cabin was the wind outside and the low settling creak of old timber, he sat alone at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, and finally, for the first time in 15 years, he drew the notebook out from beneath his shirt. His hands shook as he opened the cover. Inside, tucked between yellowed pages of rail inspection notes, was an envelope gone soft and fragile with age, the ink on its front smeared where, once, long ago, someone's tears had fallen onto it before it was ever sealed. Beside it, wedged into the spine, a small rusted memory card, the kind that hadn't been made in over a decade. Elias sat staring at both of them for a long, long time, the fire burning low, the watch in his pocket ticking on and on into the dark, and did not yet let himself decide what he was going to do. The summons came 10 days later, a hearing to formalize the guardianship transfer, to be signed not in a courtroom but in the glass-walled conference room of Ashworth, Kellerman and Doyle, 31 floors above downtown Calgary. Elias wore his one good jacket, the collar a little too tight around a neck that had spent 40 years bent over engines instead of boardroom tables. Toby was told to wait in the lobby. He didn't. Julianne sat at the head of the polished table when Elias walked in, legs crossed, a cup of coffee she hadn't touched cooling in front of her, and something in her posture, loose, victorious, already halfway to relief, told Elias she believed this was already over. "We won't drag this out," Grant said, sliding a single page and a gold-nibbed pen across the table toward Elias. "Sign at the bottom. Initial the 2 boxes on page 2. Once notarized, this concludes matters." "Those hands have handled a lot of grease in their time," Julianne said, not quite hiding the curl at the corner of her mouth. "It'll be nice for you, Dad. No more courtroom threats hanging over your head. No more Ms. Whitfield knocking at 8 in the morning." Elias didn't reach for the pen. He reached, instead, into the breast pocket of his jacket, and the room went still enough that everyone in it, Grant, Julianne, even the receptionist who'd lingered a moment too long by the door, heard the small, steady sound that lived there. Tick. 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 He drew out the notebook. 15 years of rail inspection notes, soft leather gone dark and glossy at the corners from being carried against a chest, day after day, for so long it had become part of him. From between its pages he drew a single folded sheet, the paper thin and yellowed, the ink in places smudged where old tears had once fallen before it was ever sealed shut. He set it on the table and slid it, unhurried, toward Grant. "Read that," he said. "Before anybody signs anything." Grant frowned, picked it up more out of professional habit than concern, and began to read. Elias watched the exact moment it happened, watched the practiced, faintly bored expression drain out of the young lawyer's face, watched his eyes stop moving forward and instead track back to the top of the page, rereading, as though the first pass must have been a mistake. It was a confession, written in a young woman's hand, dated nearly 15 years earlier. A plea, scrawled in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, to a brother who had come running the moment she called. An admission, full, damning, unambiguous, that it had been her hands on the wheel that winter night outside Canmore, her blood alcohol over the limit, her car that struck the Whitlock family sedan and killed a man on his way home from a night shift. And beneath it, in the same trembling hand, the arrangement she had begged her brother to agree to, that Daniel, unmarried, already estranged from a law career he'd walked away from, would tell the RCMP he'd been the one driving. That he would take the record, the guilt, the ruin, so that Julianne, 20 years old, 1 semester from finishing her undergraduate degree, her whole future still ahead of her, could keep the clean slate she needed to get into law school. Daniel Thorne had not died a drunk in a ditch. He had spent the last years of his life slowly drowning in what he'd agreed to carry, the record he didn't earn, the reputation he didn't deserve, the isolation of a truth he'd sworn never to tell his own son, until the weight of it, and not the whiskey most people assumed, had finally stopped his heart in a cabin outside Canmore that was, in every way that mattered, this one. Julianne. Grant's voice had gone thin, stripped of all its courtroom polish. "Is this real?" She didn't answer. She was staring at the page from across the table, her face draining of color the way sky drains of light before a storm, because she recognized, even upside down, even after 15 years, the exact slant of her own handwriting. "You told me your brother had a record," Grant said slowly, and something in his tone had shifted from confusion into something colder, the sound of a man doing very fast arithmetic on what a scandal like this could do to a family name, a firm's reputation, an engagement announced 3 weeks ago in the Calgary Herald. He set the page down as though it had grown suddenly hot, and pushed his chair back an inch, putting distance between himself and the table, between himself and her. "Grant," Julianne started. He didn't answer her either. He looked instead at Elias, and for the first time in 2 weeks, there was no contempt left in his face at all, only the pale, careful look of a man realizing exactly how close he'd come to signing his own name beside a lie that size. Julianne's composure did not break loudly. It simply came apart, her shoulders dropping, her hands coming up to cover her mouth, a small, broken sound escaping from behind her fingers. 15 years of a story she'd built her whole life on top of, the drunk brother, the failed father, the working-class stain she'd spent a decade scrubbing off her name, collapsing in the space of a single page. "He never told anyone," she whispered, staring at the letter as though it might still be lying to her. 15 years. "He never, no," Elias said. Not cruel. Not triumphant. Just tired, and true. "Neither did I." He reached forward, calm and slow, and folded the letter back along its old, soft creases, and returned it to the notebook, and the notebook to the pocket over his heart, where it had lived for so long it had become another kind of heartbeat. "I'm not here to ruin you," he said. "I could have. God knows there were nights these last 2 weeks I wanted to. But your brother didn't carry this so it could be used to hurt you. He carried it so you'd get to have this life. I'm not about to be the one who takes it from you now." He stood. His knees complained in the cold air of the conference room the same way they complained every morning, and he didn't try to hide it. "There's no guardianship transfer," he said. "There's no more custody claim. It ends here. Today." Nobody at the table argued. It was only as Elias turned toward the door that he saw Toby standing just outside it, half hidden by the frosted glass, his face pale, his eyes wide. He'd slipped past the receptionist and followed, and had clearly caught the last several minutes without understanding all of it, without knowing what exactly was written on that yellowed page, knowing only what he could read in the room itself: his aunt, undone, the lawyer, retreating, his grandfather, calm and unbroken, walking toward him. Elias didn't explain it there, in that glass room 31 floors above the city. He simply reached out and took his grandson's trembling hand in his own weathered one, and walked him out past the reception desk, past the floor-to-ceiling windows framing a city Elias had never once wanted, and down into the cold, clean air of the parking garage, where the truck was waiting to take them both home. He told him the rest that night, by the fire, in the cabin at Banff, with the wind hushing itself against the windows the way it always did once the worst of a storm had passed. He told him plainly, without cruelty toward Julianne, without dressing it up, that his father had not died a criminal or a drunk, but a man who'd given up everything, silently, so someone he loved could keep a future. Toby cried, and Elias let him, and didn't try to fill the quiet afterward with anything except his hand resting steady on the boy's shoulder. The laptop stayed in its box in the corner of Toby's room for 3 days before he finally opened it, not to browse the private school website Julianne had bookmarked, but to look up torque specifications for a 1972 Ski-Doo carburetor, because the one in the workshop had been giving them trouble all winter and he wanted, this time, to actually understand why. By the second week of December, the two of them worked most evenings side by side at the bench, elbow to elbow, breath fogging in the cold garage air, Toby's hands slowly losing their softness the way hands do when they're taught to hold a wrench instead of a game controller, Elias correcting his grip without ever raising his voice. "Like this," Elias said one evening, guiding Toby's fingers around the carburetor bowl. "Feel that? That's the float sticking." "I feel it," Toby said, and grinned, the first easy grin Elias had seen on him in a month. Outside, snow fell soft and steady over the Rockies, burying the drive, burying the fence line, burying, in its slow patient way, everything that had happened in Calgary under a season Elias had always trusted to set things right. Inside, the wood stove popped and settled, throwing its warm light across a kitchen that smelled, as it always had, of stew and machine oil and home. Elias sat back in his chair and watched his grandson's hands move steady and sure over the old engine, and in his breast pocket, against the beat of his own heart, the silver watch that had outlasted a railway career, a sun, and a life 15 years wide kept its same unbroken rhythm, ticking on into the warm dark of a house that had never, not for one single day, stopped being a real one. Some nights I still take the watch out just to hold it, not to check the hour, because out here the hour hardly matters once the light's gone from the ridge. I turn it over in my palm the way I used to turn it over on the section gang 30 years ago, waiting on a signal to change, and I think about how long a thing can sit against a man's chest before it stops being metal and starts being something closer to a second pulse. 31 years of track inspections bought me this watch. 15 more years of silence taught me what it actually meant to carry it. I don't open the notebook anymore. I know every crease in that letter without needing to see it, the exact place where the ink runs where somebody's tears fell on it before it was ever folded shut. I used to think keeping it meant keeping Daniel's name clean in a drawer somewhere, safe, untouched. Now I know it meant something plainer. A boy got to grow up believing his father was a man worth being named after, right up until the day he was old enough to hear the rest of it without it taking him apart. Toby asks me things now he never used to. Not about carburetors, though he asks plenty of those too, elbow deep beside me most evenings with grease to the wrist, same as his father used to get it, same as I still do. He asks what Daniel's laugh sounded like. He asks if his father was any good with his hands before the drinking got bad, and I tell him yes, better than good, better than me at his age, and I watch something settle into the boy's shoulders when I say it, like a joint finally seating right after years of grinding loose. The cabin still leaks a little around the north window when the wind comes hard off the pass. Ms. Whitfield doesn't come around anymore. Julianne sends a card at Christmas now, nothing more, and I don't know yet what I'll do the day she asks for more than that, but I'm not carrying that decision tonight. Tonight there's just the stove ticking as the pine settles, and the watch ticking against my ribs, and Toby's breathing gone slow and even on the far side of the fire, and somewhere under both those small steady sounds, the sound of a house that was always exactly what I told Julianne it was, that first night at the table, before any of this began.